Hello and welcome to Drone On, the only podcast in the air and on the airwaves. I am your host, Bryce Bladen, and on this show, we explore the tech, economics, and people piloting the world's largest standardized drone imagery network. Each episode, we explore how drones are reshaping industries, creating new economic opportunities, and literally changing how we see the world. On today's episode, I look into how the world's largest drone imagery network was actually created, tracking its first missions in Canada to covering over 200 municipalities in North America. Today's guest is the operations manager of Spexi Geospatial Inc., Graham Anderson. Graham, you've been on the show before, but why don't you give us a quick intro to yourself before we dive into what you've done with Spexi and the soon-to-be clarified LayerDrone?
Yeah, absolutely, Bryce. Thank you for having me again. As you mentioned, I'm the operations manager for Spexi, which really means I am what we call supply side focused. So pilot focused on getting pilots into the network, getting them onboarded, getting drones in the air, growing the pilot community, ensuring safe and efficient operations across currently North America, but also growing that community to become a global community as a long-term vision.
Absolutely. So let's set the setting for everyone, because something that I had very wrong about the story of this network originally was I was under the impression that Spexi had kind of been taking its current business model and has been pursuing it since 2018. But in actuality, Spexi's journey for what would become the LayerDrone network, in my mind, really started in 2023. And from 2018 until then, it might be more accurate to position Spexi as a sort of software as a service platform for companies that required aerial data. And as a business, Spexi was seemingly succeeding at creating customer demand, but finding supply at that scale was an ongoing challenge, still is, for the team and for the platform, because people don't just want an acre of imagery. They usually want the whole city and things of that effect. What Spexi is selling here is what companies want, and giving it to them was a challenge. Consistent, high-quality data that could be delivered from any consumer drone, but delivering it via on-demand capture and at scale required coordinating, well, even to start, pilots. So in 2023, my understanding is that Spexi effectively began building their own supply chain of what would become the LayerDrone network, and eventually it would become the world's largest drone network. But my understanding is this all starts around the summer of 2023 with the Trusted Alpha. Can you walk us through that, Graham?
Yeah, I'd actually take us back a year, and you'd have to go to Bill Lakeland, honestly, to get the early days story, because I joined in January of 2023. But, the early days of Spexi, Bill has always had this vision of sort of breaking the world or the map into some sort of quadrant or some sort of, bite-sized piece, and then standardizing that data capture so that pilots could do that. But the technology and the sort of the capabilities and the incentive structures didn't really exist at the time Bill started Spexi, along with co-founder Peter, current CTO at the time. So this is around 2018, what you're kind of thinking about. Come 2022, with the release and proliferation of the Mavic Minis, smaller, higher quality consumer grade drones, and then their introduction to cryptocurrency in the DPIN space particularly, so the idea of an incentive model that could be scaled rapidly. The pieces sort of fell into place technologically and culturally and things like that for what Bill's early vision had been. And that was when they sort of started their seed fund investment pitch, sort of really bringing the idea into sort of the child or the baby stages of what it is today. So I would call that 2022, and they raised funds for something akin to what we have today throughout 2022, and that seed round closed I think in October of 2022. That was a $5.5 million seed round from predominantly cryptocurrency investors to build a drone imagery DPIN. And I was introduced to the network at that time via a press release announcing the closure of that round. That was when I first heard of the time what was dubbed Spexigon. So we've actually gone through a couple of branding changes, but they released it under the name Spexigon. Does that give you an origin story and something to go on from that point and bring us to 2023?
Really does. You quite literally started with the seeds of this thing in 2022. But take us to 2023. How does that lead to what were some of the first missions flown for the network, for the Trusted Alpha. And what did the Trusted Alpha look like in scale? I imagine it would be quite a bit different than what you'd see from the network today.
Oh yeah, I mean there were lots of it's hard to decide or imagine and project what something's going to look like when a number of drones start flying sort of at the same time. We did through the first half of 2023. Our engineering team was developing sort of some of the flight mission controls and the mobile application in a very rudimentary form. And our COO, Alec Wilson, and myself were some of the very early test pilots. So I recall, in the spring of 2023, flying some of these tests. The hexagons, now the H3 grid that we used, didn't really show up on the map kind of at all. It only had an outline. Once you flew it, there was no indication that the mission had been completed visually. So if you put more than a couple on the map, then suddenly you'd forget, which ones you had flown versus which ones you had not. Mission launches were very different. So that, kind of, I think it was probably around May, June that Alec and I and a couple of the engineers were flying these very, very initial test missions. And it was like, will the drone even take off, right? Will our software talk through the SDK to the drone, and will it control it, and will it go to the place that it's supposed to go? And, I probably have a notebook somewhere filled with notes from some of those very first tests that I flew off the roof of my garage, actually here in Vernon, BC. So really, really different at that time. The first, what we called the Trusted Pilot Alpha was, we worked with a team in Cochrane, Alberta, Osprey Integrity, some pilots, drone pilots that were professionals. They have a drone services company that we've known for quite some time. Alec and myself are professional operators because the application was call it unstable. It was very new, didn't always complete or fly the way that you maybe expected to fly. So we wanted to make sure people that were using it were experienced operators. They would be able to deal with, the drone losing connection or, some sort of issue that they might run into. That first Trusted Pilot Alpha, we called it. That first Alpha was flown over Cochrane. It was about 230 missions, core missions, some larger missions. We were actually also talking to the city of Cochrane, so they were interested in the data. One of the other reasons we chose that area. They ran 288 what we call panorama missions and about 30 mapping missions. They did that over a number of days. We weren't in a big hurry. They fit it into their schedule, but they had to use actually a Google My Maps that we created. So we created an entirely, we took the hexagons and we put them into a Google My Maps, and they would use the Google My Maps to inform themselves, like edit the map and change the color to say, yes, I flew this one. There were about 4 pilots, I think, that flew. And they needed to tell each other, like, that one's already been flown, because the application interface didn't identify as it does now, like locked or closed or flown. It was just there. It just existed on the interface. So they did that over about 2 weeks. They flew all of those missions, and they were changing the colors in the My Maps, and we obviously were collaborating and able to see that and speak with them each day. And overall, it was, what I considered to be a resounding success. They were able to complete all of the missions. The imagery, flowed sort of as it should, and they didn't have any incidents or negative issues with the drone. So quite an experience. That took about 2 weeks, and it ended in late summer of 2023.
So that was just not even a dozen pilots yet. That was you, Alex, COO of Spexi, maybe another pilot from the team, and then what I'd call maybe community pilots. Not to diminish their impact, but
yeah, I mean they were professional operators. I call the user group professional operators who had a statement of work and were they were the first outside of the Spexi company to download the application, to get access to a link to download the application onto a device and fly the drones via the Spexi application. And yeah, I think four of them maybe flew from their team.
So if I'm not mistaken, just looking at the network data, most recently about 700 flights were flown yesterday, 700 missions for the network. How does that number compare to the Trusted Alpha altogether?
Twice as many in a day as they did in a couple of weeks.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's the Trusted Alpha. So that went in Cochrane, Alberta, near the sunny beaches of Canada. It's a joke. It's a valley. My mom lives in Cochrane. Fun fact. So Spexi and what would become the LayerDrone network start there around June or August 2023. City of Cochrane as a customer. We've got about 3 or 4 professional operators, as well as a couple on the Spexi team doing all this work. This brings us to the Open Alpha, which I believe pretty much starts right after the initial Cochrane campaign. Is that correct?
Yeah, about a month later. And I wouldn't call this one open yet. We were still heavily vetting all of the pilots. We weren't meeting them in person anymore. We didn't necessarily know them face to face, but they had to jump through quite a few hoops. They had to pass a small, a quiz that we gave them. They had to provide some, information about who they were. We called it a known user alpha. So we went from a trusted pilots alpha, where we trust these people, we know them, they're professional operators, to this is a group of people. We know who they are. They've provided some information about themselves, and they've passed some, they've passed some sort of onboarding steps. And that was about a month later, maybe a little bit more. We ran that in Surrey, British Columbia, 2,200 missions. So 2,200 missions, quite a lot larger, obviously, in terms of coverage area. We're looking at eight times as many as we did in Cochrane. 22 pilots that flew. We onboarded close to 50. Our goal was to get to 50 who could fly, who had access to the application. We wanted 50 pilots that, we knew. We got very close to that. Only 22 ended up flying, and that's a variety of reasons. Some people weren't free those days. Some people weren't available, didn't have their drone ready, whatever it might be. But 22 pilots flew. Again, a little over 2 weeks, 18 days or so from the time we opened the missions, launched the missions. At this point, we do have, one of the changes over that month or 6 weeks in between the two alphas was some UI that allowed pilots to have situational awareness and see what zones had been flown, not only for themselves, but for other pilots. So to be able to see in-app where they were operating and which zones they had completed versus which zones another pilot was flying and or had completed. This to obviously avoid multiple pilots flying in the same zone at the same time, or being in the same area and not knowing, potentially causing some sort of hazard. So big UI change over those 4 to 6 weeks, and then a launch of 2,200 missions, which at the time we had, we just didn't know how it would go. We hadn't met these people in person. We were speaking to them in our Discord server. They had to sort of report for duty, but then they just went and flew. And one of the really early memories that I have was two of them actually running into each other at a Starbucks in Surrey, and then in the Discord sharing a picture of the two of them, like one's in line and the other one sees that he's carrying a drone and says, "Hey, are you doing Spexi?" "Yeah, I'm doing Spexigon at the time." "Are you flying Spexigon?" "And yeah, I'm flying Spexigon." "Hey, cool." And they sat and had a coffee with one another, and it was a pretty cool early memory and experience from the network.
Cool. So remind me what that stage is referred to as. You had the trusted alpha in Cochrane.
Then a known user alpha, we called it.
Known user alpha in Surrey. This brings us to that delightful border and the U.S. When did the network make its way into the USA?
Actually, prior to jumping into the U.S., we ran another known user alpha in Kelowna, British Columbia. And so interesting bit of learning there. That was 500 missions, so a little bit smaller than the Surrey one. This was an attempt to sort of open up a new geography to understand how, if our ability to attract pilots and advertise and onboard new users could be replicated in a different geography, right? So for those that aren't familiar, Kelowna, about 4 hours from Vancouver or from Surrey, where the initial alpha had taken place. So we kind of went, okay, what if we want to do this in another city? Are we able to sort of replicate the results? And one of the interesting things we learned was that pilots would travel. So a number of our Surrey pilots decided to make that 4-hour drive up to Kelowna, into Kelowna, and take their gear and, go and earn and fly Spexigons in Kelowna. And we went, oh, that's, interesting. We hadn't assumed maybe that, at these times you're trying to figure out value and pricing and how much does a pilot need to earn and how long do these flights take and what's a reasonable amount to pay. And so the idea that someone might drive that 4 hours and a handful of pilots, maybe two or three, drove up, and, you start to hear stories of, oh, I have a friend, so I stayed with him, so it made it worthwhile, or I just went for the afternoon or one night. And so that was an interesting sort of discovery from the second known user alpha, vetted users, essentially. And then we jumped to the US. I'm going to struggle with time frames a little bit. My memory might be fuzzy. I'd have to go look at that first zone that was ever flown, and it's actually not too hard because I know where it was. It was in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so we went back to our trusted pilots, essentially, was what we did. It looks like January of 2024 was when we flew our first US flights. And I do recall getting my own Part 107 license because I knew I would want to get down and do some testing, and US pilots require a Part 107 license for commercial operations. So we have a bit of a break. I think Kelowna was October of 2023, and then we're not into the US until January of 2024.
It is so interesting. Quick, spell Albuquerque.
ALBER. Well, I don't know. Q.
This is the exact same thing that happened to me as soon as I was taking notes during this chat. So I'm really glad you had the exact same
there's a Q
blue screen on your face. And there's a lot of U's. ALBUQUER. Thanks, New Mexico. We appreciate you being the first Spexagon in the USA.
That's right. So we went back to our MO of using professional operators for our first flight in the US. So we contracted with an organization called Alamo Airborne. Shout out to my man Yoshi, who's, I believe in Texas, is based, but they have a group of pilots across the southwestern United States. They're a professional drone services company, again, with a variety of different capabilities. And we reached out to them. I'd been connected with Yoshi through LinkedIn and social media for a time. And so I said, hey, we're looking to do this. Can you help us fly some of these early flights? Again, wanting to make sure that the pilot was someone who was a professional operator, would take all the due precautions in given the application was still very much in alpha and would be able to complete some test flights for us. The initial test cities we had identified were actually San Francisco and Austin, but the operator that they selected for the project was based out of Albuquerque. So the first zones that we dropped to allow her to just trial the application and understand what her operating sort of parameters would be when she went to San Francisco and Austin, we dropped some demo test missions over near her home in Albuquerque.
Very cool. All right. So when does this move from alpha to private beta?
That would be then, I guess, spring of 24. So we had this operator from Alamo. Her name was Monica, and she flew about 50 zones in San Francisco. She went to San Francisco, and we had laid down some missions there, and she flew a number of those, although she ran into the early challenges of operating in urban environments with tall buildings and all of these things that this started to uncover for us about signal strength and visual line of sight and a whole bunch of things. So she completed a number of those along with some smaller projects, side projects for Niantic Labs, who we'd been speaking with at the time about collecting some of this imagery. Then she went to Austin and did some missions there. But there were a number of, we wanted to see a little more, and I wanted to get a real feel for on the ground flight in these urban environments. So I actually went down to San Francisco in January of 24, and flew a number of zones there and spent about 3 or 4 days in San Francisco and wandered around the Mission District and areas like that were covered with these zones. And I knew nothing about San Francisco, so it's quite not I knew nothing, but I had never been. It was my first time going to San Francisco, so it was an interesting experience. Great city. I really enjoyed it, and it gave me an opportunity to really empathize with our pilots and understand, because a lot of the flying I had done to that point had been, near my home or over my home, very familiar environments, relatively low rise, not a lot of challenging airspace or anything like that. So that was my first look at an experience with trying to get as many missions as I could in a day, spending a whole day flying versus just an hour or two or a couple of missions. I was getting 30, 35 missions in a day. The challenges with batteries, the challenges of charging in an environment like that. I had a rental car, the challenges of finding parking and moving around the city, deciding whether I should walk for these ones or drive for these ones, or when I should move the vehicle or how I should operate at that sort of scale. And then obviously just the urban environment and buildings and all sorts of things like that. So really good experience for me. Moni had then wrapped up around that time in Austin, and we sort of had our test information from the US. And then a couple of months before we went on to the beta that spring.
Great. All right. So the beta basically goes from the spring of 2024 until, arguably now. I believe now we are in the public beta, however. What we were previously describing would have been the private beta. And I think one of the major milestones to come out of the private beta, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that this would be the state where the network had gone from effectively those original few hundred missions in Cochrane to over 1 million acres imaged. Do I have that timeline on that milestone about right?
Yeah. We had a contract for, one of these sort of research and development contracts with the government of Canada, the federal government, in conjunction with the province of British Columbia. I may have some of those details wrong. I don't know exactly who the contractee was or the contractor, but to fly and collect imagery data from every urban environment in British Columbia. That was about 30,000 missions through the spring and summer of 2024. And that was what we still called a private user beta. And essentially that meant that you had to come into the only place you could get the link to download the application. It wasn't live in the Play Store. So you had to come into our Discord. You had to speak to us. You had to kind of jump through a hoop or two. Okay, we had to give you, a specific role as a pilot, and you had to pass a little quiz that showed that you had some idea about flight safety and flight operations. And then we would give you access to essentially the link to download onto your phone so that you could operate. So that's for us, the distinction between what we call the private beta and the public beta was the day that the application was launched in the Google Play Store. And essentially that takes control out of our hands. We now cannot vet the users except with whatever's within the application. So, a little guided tour and some information within the application. But any user at that point in North America, anyone with an Android phone could download the application and begin operating, which, was for us a little bit of what do you call it? It's kind of like letting your teenage kid out to drive your car for the first time, right? You're not in the passenger seat anymore. They can't communicate with you. They may not be aware that there's a Discord. They might not know how to contact you if something goes wrong. They may not be able to, so up until that point, everyone had to be in the Discord to get the link. So everyone was able to provide feedback. Everyone was able to say, I had this experience. I ran into that. This was my issue or my problem, or this went really well, or that didn't go well. At that point, when we launched it into the Google Play Store, that's gone now. There are users that are using the application and submitting data, and we have no idea who they are and no direct way to communicate with them. So that's the distinction for us between private beta and public beta.
It makes perfect sense. And when exactly was that? If I'm looking at the Google Play Store, right, I've got like late 2024.
Yeah, probably November, December of 2024, I think, that we went to public beta. So we're just a year into that now.
Got it. And at this point, aspects of the network were already on what is called testnet. Is that correct?
Yeah, they've all, right from the beginning, aspects have been on testnet. We originally we had planned to launch on the Flow blockchain, actually. The first NFTs that were called flight records at the time in the private beta and, the private alpha, the trusted alpha and the known user alpha, there was actually a two-part process to the data upload. So you had to first upload the flight record. So you sort of did an upload that uploaded the record of the flight, and then you did the imagery upload that verified the two pieces together. But an NFT was created on the Polygon blockchain at that time. So the initial thought was Flow. Then we moved to Polygon. We have since moved to Arbitrum, the Sepolia, and we plan to launch on Base. So it's actually been a bit of a migration, but throughout that entire time, NFTs of the flights have been minted on a testnet blockchain.
Got it. And so this end of the year, 2024, at this point, if I am reading this data correctly, the network had about, or was approaching 2 million acres imaged. Throughout the year of 2024, 7 figures had been done just on testnet revenue for Spexi as a business. And I think this leads us into 2025, where the network is still in public beta, still on testnet, but the main big thing that's coming is a little something called LayerDrone, which was formally established in April 2025. Anything you wanted to say on that?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier there was some branding shifts, or a lot of conversations, some of them quite fierce, about the brand, right? Spexi Geospatial was the initial incorporated brand that Bill Lakeland had begun back in 2018, when the project that we see now as the LayerDrone network was sort of proposed in 2022. The idea for a Spexagon, a zone or unit of work, came up, which was this hexagon, provisioned by Spexi, and you put those two together and you get a Spexigon, a spatial hexagon or a viewable hexagon, whatever you want. There were a few different ideas about why that worked. And we really liked that. We really liked the idea of the Spexagon network, and that was what it was called from late 2022, early 2023, maybe close to a year. Then there were some questions about, whether I don't recall why it came up, but there was a lot of talk about whether Spexi was. It was hard to differentiate between what was Spexi Geospatial and what was Spexagon, and why were there these two names and what was the difference. And so eventually the decision was made to make everything just Spexi. It was Spexi was the network, Spexi was everything. But the subsequent decision to spin out a foundation that would sort of be more decentralized necessitated a new brand, a new way to distinguish between Spexi Incorporated, the rent-seeking entity that would sell data into a commercial marketplace, and whatever this network or foundation would be that would collect that data and build a decentralized layer of high-resolution aerial imagery. Those couldn't be the same thing if we wanted to achieve the long-term goals that we had set out for ourselves. There was a requirement that one be separate from the other in a number of both legal, but then also in name, like in identification. And so that was the impetus for creating the LayerDrone network, which spun out of Spexi, was built from some of Spexi's IP, but essentially was separated into a new entity that will, going forward, be the tokenized and decentralized distributed network that will collect and house all of the imagery that Spexi then acquires and performs a variety of different activities upon that data to make it value added and saleable into the marketplace.
Absolutely. I've always found it extremely useful to think about these things in terms of, effectively, at the beginning of the show, I introduced Spexi, their founding in 2018, and how they were really seeking the demand for their product. And then eventually, Spexi sort of took on creating the supply that would drive demand of their product. And what you just told me was, in effect, the story of Spexi building its own supply chain. And moving forward, the LayerDrone Foundation is effectively responsible for stewarding that chain and continuing to grow it as Spexi has up to this point, which up to this point, time of this recording, late 2025, over 5 million acres image, we're approaching 6 million, over 175,000 missions flown, over 8,000 registered pilots. Things have grown quite a bit. It's not a straightforward shot like any story is, like any real narrative, but it's a very interesting one in that Spexi has proven demand of their network. Spexi has proven they can supply the network, but they are segmenting the demand and the supply in a way that will hopefully allow it to grow exponentially. But we've been talking about this for well over a half an hour at this point, Graham, and I want to be respectful of your time. Is there anything else about the story of the network, how it came to be from those early flights in Cochrane to where it's at today, that you think merits mentioning or often gets overlooked when you are telling the narrative of Spexi and LayerDrone and the world's largest standardized drone imagery network?
There's two things I'd like to touch on, and you just said the word there, standardized. And I think one of the unlocks in the drone industry that Spexi is shooting for, LayerDrone is shooting for, that I haven't seen anyone else sort of dial in on, is that standardization. Is the imagery that we're collecting and that we're offering up for sale or for access to is the same. And what that required was settling on a sensor type or a drone type, so settling on a specific piece of hardware, settling on a specific standard for the size of image capture and the type of imagery that we would be collecting. There are a couple of types now, but basically it's two types of imagery that we collect, settling on the mission parameters and the payment parameters. So that piece of, we have one-ish product that we are building for and that we offer that we think is of enough value to enough users that we can create a global application that will deliver this data type. So standardization is one, and the other is the pilots, right? The pilot community that we have created, that we continue to create, we couldn't have built what we have built without their trialing and testing and feedback. I mean, drones have been lost, drones have been crashed, drones, we have had our fair share of trials and tribulations with pilots. They have been patient with payment, figuring out, we've moved through a few different ways that we paid them from early on, like literally e-transfers, and different types of contracting, to where we are now with Stripe, to moving forward to tokenization. These step-by-step iterations could not have happened without these pilots sort of being these, what do you call the early adopters of a new technology, right? And being willing to try something that's difficult at times, that's frustrating, doesn't work the way that they expect it to work, that, puts them in situations or scenarios where they're approached by the public who is upset, who doesn't like drones, that puts them in, they're traveling lots of them around the US now at their own expense, obviously paid for the efforts and the data they submit. But really just a huge thank you to these sort of pioneering pilots in the network across North America that have surprised us and provided feedback and made suggestions that now exist within the user interface to say, hey, it would be really nice if we were able to do it this way. And they continue to do so. And so we are constantly adding to our sort of product roadmap suggestions and ideas from that community based on their experiences in the field.
Extremely well said, Graham. I want to be respectful of your time, but I also want you to play the fun segment at the end of the show if you have time.
I do have a few more minutes. So what are we playing this time?
Today we are going to be playing Innovation or Idiotic. So, Graham, point of this statement, I'm going to tell you two truths and a lie. You're going to tell me which of those two are actual real-world innovations and which one is an idiotic lie I just made up. Item number 1. Intel set the Guinness World Record by simultaneously flying 5,000 drones in a coordinated light show over a single location. Number 2, a Norwegian company uses drones with thermal cameras to locate and rescue people in avalanches to reduce search times from hours to minutes. Item number 3, Domino's tested pizza delivery drones in New Zealand that kept the pizzas hot by using the built-in warming chambers powered by the drone's battery and offset heat. Which of these is a lie? Which of these are defining our tech future?
Not sure how you say 5,000 drones, and I'm wondering if you're trying to catch me on a technicality, like it was only 4,900 drones. I do believe Intel was one that shot at a Guinness record at some point. I would believe a search and rescue crew might use a thermal camera on a drone. I don't think that Domino's had a drone where you would put the pizza inside the drone to deliver it. It would be a very large drone, and it would be very difficult to do that. So I am going to say that number 3 is the lie.
Bad news, Graham. Actually, the lie was Intel setting that record. So 2 things. 1, Intel did originally have the record. It was around 3,000 to 4,000 simultaneous drones. My understanding is a Chinese company called Higrate has absolutely blasted this record. At least 5,100 that I can verify, although I'm seeing reports saying that one of their shows had 16,000 drones involved, which seems like too many. But at the end of the day, I have to be careful with you on this segment. You know too much about drones. I remember when I tried playing a bunch of annoying sounds and you were like, that's a DJI Mini Phantom moving at this fast in this sort of cloud cover. And I was like, okay, I can't.
You got me with that one. Yeah, I'm curious now to see what that Domino's drone looked like.
I am going to be Googling it as soon as I hang up on you. Thank you again for your time, Graham.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bryce.
Thanks for listening to Drone On. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to get a new episode every week. And leave us a 5-star review on your podcast app of choice. You can learn more about our sponsors at Spexi.com, that's SPEXI.com, and LayerDrone.org. Find out how you can contribute to the world's largest drone imagery network too. Thanks again for listening.